everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as director of both the library here in Ann Arbor and also the museum in Grand Rapids. We're very pleased to have you with us this evening for a new series of programming that we've just started in the last couple of years, which is to invite winners of the Ford Journalism Awards for Distinguished Reporting to be with us. Tonight's winner is not just a one or a two but a three-time winner of the award, and we're very honored to have him here. To give you a little background about the award itself, the Ford Journalism Award has been given annually for 21 years and is presented at a June event at the National Press Club in Washington. While the stipend for the award comes from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, the selection of the winner is made by an independent panel of journalists and journalism faculty from around the country, chaired by Jim Cannon. In addition to this award for writing on national defense, there is also an award for distinguished reporting on the presidency. The 2008 winner of that award was Kenneth Walsh of U.S. News and World Report. In winning the award for reporting on national defense, tonight's speaker, James Kitfield, joins the distinguished company of prior winners, including Rick Atkinson from the Washington Post, James Astle from The Economist, Mark Mazzetti of the New York Times, and Linda Robinson of U.S. News and World Report. That's not bad company. In the view of many journalists, and we talked about this a little bit tonight, this award is equivalent to being elected by your peers to win an Oscar. So, ladies and gentlemen, consider yourselves at the Academy Awards of Journalism tonight. To introduce our distinguished speaker, it's a pleasure for me to welcome my colleague from the museum, Barbara McGregor, who is our education specialist working with curriculum and school groups there. Barb has supported the work of the Independent Selection Committee for the last several years, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Elaine. Good evening, all. It is really my pleasure to be over here in Ann Arbor tonight to introduce this evening's speaker. And I also want to add my welcome to Elaine's. It's great to see all of you here. When I introduce someone at the museum, I recognize half the faces in the audience. So this is kind of fun tonight. I don't recognize any of you. I first had the opportunity to become acquainted with James Kitfield last spring while I was assisting, as Elaine said, the Gerald R. Ford Foundation with their Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize competition. James was one of the entries submitted for reporting on national defense and turned over to our esteemed panel of judges, again, as Elaine said, headed by Jim Cannon. Not long after I submitted all of the essays to the judges, or the articles, I was notified that James was the 2009 winner for reporting on national defense in 2008. And then, the fun part of the job, I had the good fortune of being the person to notify James that he was the winner. The awards are presented each year by Jack Ford, chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, and son of President and Mrs. Ford at the National Press Club. I want to take just a minute to share the judge's citation with you. I think it will not only give you insight into James' research and reporting skills, but also what the judges look for in winning entries. Mr. Kitfield, in the view of the judges, hit a home run with each submission. The quality and breadth were extraordinary, providing a tour de horizon of the critical issues of our times, from the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan to the strategic significance of Pakistan, to break out from the nuclear non-proliferation regime to the dangers of stumbling into confrontation with Russia. Each was superbly written to guide readers through a web of complex concepts and relationships. And just a side note, I've been told that there are copies of the 5 articles James submitted this round in the lobby. They'll be available for you if you want to take your own copies home with you when you leave. In addition to being the now 3-time recipient of the Ford Journalism Prize, James has received numerous other awards and recognitions for his reporting. A sampling of these include being the 2-time winner of the Military Reporters and Editors Association Top Prize for Excellence in Overseas Reporting for his coverage of both the surge in Iraq and firsthand coverage of the invasion of Iraq. The Stuart L. Sutton Media Excellence Award, sponsored by the Association of Former Intelligence Officers for his coverage of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the Edwin Hood Award for Diplomatic Correspondence, given annually by the National Press Club to recognize excellence in reporting on diplomatic and foreign policy issues. Mr. Kitfield graduated magna cum laude from the University of Georgia's Henry Grady School of Journalism in 1978. Prior to his arrival in Washington, D.C., he served in Europe as managing editor of Overseas Life magazine for 5 years. Overseas Life is a magazine for U.S. servicemen and women stationed abroad. His reporting has also appeared in the National Interest, Omni, Newsday, Los Angeles Magazine, Army Times, Air Force Magazine, The Stars and Stripes, Off Duty, and numerous other publications. James is currently serving as the National Security and Foreign Affairs Correspondent for National Journal, continuing his 20-plus year career reporting on defense, national security, and foreign policy issues from Washington, D.C. In addition to his award-winning reporting, James is the author of 2 books, War and Destiny, published by Potomac Books in 2005, and Prodigal Soldiers, published by Simon & Schuster in 1995. General Wesley Clark called War and Destiny a book about how the Bush Revolution in foreign and military affairs redefined American power masterful and an incredibly insightful portrayal of war, diplomacy, national security policymaking, and the struggle for American success in Iraq. The U.S. Naval Institute proceedings said the book explains the neoconservative ideology and its effects with such clarity that nothing happening today in Iraq, Afghanistan, or elsewhere should be a surprise. Tonight, Mr. Kitfield is here to discuss A World of Woes, America at a Crossroads. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming James Kitfield.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you guys tonight and to have my first visit to the Ford Library. The first time I won the Ford Award in 1990, I was only on this beat maybe a couple of years. It was my first award, actually, for this beat. And I can tell you, for someone who worked for a small magazine, trying to sort of swim with the big boys, it was very, very welcome. Happily, my mother was at that award ceremony and got to meet President Ford. And for anyone here who's lucky enough to have met President Ford, he's obviously one of the most decent and gracious politicians ever been sent to Washington, and it was a real highlight for her to see me there. I don't think my mother was ever more proud of me than that day. She passed a few years later, but I, for that reason, have a very, very warm spot in my heart for the Ford Library and for President Ford. I've also always thought that the Ford Award really reflects values that were reflected in President Ford himself. Substance, nonpartisanship, and truthfulness. And it's kind of funny because in the mid-'70s when I was in journalism school, I was very angry at President Ford about the pardon of Richard Nixon. You know, as a journalism student, you can imagine, you know, I held in awe Woodward and Bernstein and the concept that, you know, 2 enterprising young reporters could speak truth to power and take down a corrupt president. When I was at this most recent Ford Award, I got a chance to talk to President Ford's sons. And it turns out they too were sort of upset with their father, that they had had discussions with him about the Nixon pardon, and they advised him not to do that, knowing that it would probably doom his chances for election. And Ford's response was to tell his sons that being president was not unlike being a father. Sometimes his sons made him angry, President Ford said, but in the end he always forgave them for the sake of the family. So it was, as President Ford said, even if it cost him the election, he would pardon Nixon for the sake of healing the nation. And I remember thinking when I heard that story from the Ford sons that that's exactly what Washington's missing these days, adult supervision. The subject I want to talk to you tonight about is one that I think will be foremost in the minds of historians when they look back on this tumultuous period we're in. How in one decade did America topple from a zenith of historical power to a nation that is now beset by deep divisions at home and a host of challenges abroad that threaten to overwhelm it? Is it possible that the American era that so decisively shaped the latter half of the 20th century is over? I know that for people who are a generation that was raised carrying the banner of Western democracies, nursed on the idea of American exceptionalism, that the very idea seems an affront. preponderance is regarded as a birthright for Americans. And indeed, less than a decade ago, when I was writing about America's role in the world, the United States was held out as the rarest of historical anomalies, a lone superpower in a unipolar world. Historians I talked to had to cast back at least to the British Empire of the 19th century and even to the Roman Empire to find historical analogies for one nation with such preponderant power on the national and the world stage. And at the turn of the millennium, the United States was still riding high in a post-Cold War wave of prosperity at home and predominance abroad without a peer competitor on the horizon. Our brand of freewheeling capitalism and democracy were ascendant around the world. It was the end of history, we were told, and we were the last best man standing, respected by our friends and emulated even by many of our former adversaries. Yet as all of us know who've lived through the last 10 years, history didn't end, and we've missed some of the storm clouds that were brewing on the far horizon of globalization. Talk of America as a lone superpower already seems the rhetoric of a bygone era now. One person who worried that that decline could prove enduring was President Ford's former National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, who I spoke to on this subject. I'd like to quote what he said. He told me that the international community no longer trusts our motives as a new phenomena, and I see it as one of many warning signs of a possible lasting realignment of global power. I don't think we're there yet, but it's certainly possible that we've created such a mess and alienated so much of the world that we can never get back to where we were at the end of the Cold War. At that time, the U.S. was considered the indispensable ingredient in any attempt to make the world better, Scowcroft told me. I still think mobilizing the world into cooperative action is our greatest strength and skill. I just don't know whether it's too late to turn back to them. Well before last year's presidential election, I wrote that the next commander-in-chief would confront a radioactive inbox without precedent in the modern American presidency. Recently, I suspect President Obama knows what I was writing about. He spent his honeymoon wrestling with the Great Recession, itself a harbinger of the global pandemics, viral, economic, extremist, criminal, political, that increasingly sweep across a world with fewer and fewer natural borders or fire breaks. As seen in the debate over national health care and climate change, Obama confronts a still deeply divided and unsettled American public. Within just a few weeks, President Obama will have to make a decision on whether to approve a request from his military commander in Afghanistan for 50,000 more troops to stop a failing war in that country, a war that has shown increasing capability to destabilize neighboring Pakistan with its nuclear arsenal. That may well prove the most consequential decision of his presidency, and it comes in Obama's first year in office, when presidents historically are more likely to stumble. It also comes at a time when the United States' standing and influence in the world is greatly diminished. As I reported last year, polls show a majority even of allied countries no longer trust America to act responsibly, let alone lead responsibly. The bipartisan Smart Power Commission last year proclaimed, quote, America may be less well regarded today than at any time in its history. Even given the goodwill that Obama has engendered around the world, that low standing can be seen today in our inability to convince our closest allies in NATO to really shoulder their fair burden of the war in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, there's still an unpopular war in Iraq to wind down and a security situation there to manage as we pull troops out in earnest next year. There's a looming conflict with Iran over its suspected nuclear weapons program and stalemate in talks with the nuclear rogue North Korea. There's a deadlocked Middle East peace process between Israel and the Palestinians that continues to sap goodwill for the United States and the Arab world. Obama confronts major challenges in our relationships with major powers as well. I suspect we're going to see rising trade tensions with our banker, China. We've seen a newly assertive Russia who's taken advantage of this period of strategic distraction for us to carve out a sphere of influence in its near abroad through intimidation if necessary, as we saw in last year's war with Georgia. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda remains a potent threat, and every major terrorist plot that's been thwarted in recent years has links back to the core al-Qaeda group in the Pakistan tribal regions. In this era of globalization, all of these challenges are interrelated and likely to affect Obama's signature initiative to check what many experts see as the greatest long-term threat to U.S. national security: the spread of doomsday weapons and the chance they might fall into the wrong hands. At the same time, Obama confronts an America whose power and the tools of its power are in considerable disrepair. As the tragic shooting and murder last week in Fort Hood, the reporting surrounding that has reminded us the all-volunteer force is overstretched, overburdened, and showing significant fracture signs. We see rising rates of suicide, divorce, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and binge drinking in the force. I recently talked to the head of the Command and General Staff College, which field grade officers come to. And he told me the incoming classes of majors and lieutenant colonels, 25% of them are unfit, either because they have hypertension, they have stress, they have high blood pressure, they drink too much, they don't get exercise. It is a very stressed force. Our intelligence community is still reeling from two of the biggest debacles in its history: the failed call on the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and the failure to see the 9/11 plot coming. As we've seen in the controversies over Iran's nuclear program, as well as in the torture memos that the Obama administration released, the intelligence community remains deeply distrustful of the executive branch that it serves. The State Department and related foreign aid agencies have proven woefully inadequate and under-resourced for the nation-building tasks they're asked to perform in Afghanistan and Iraq, which in turn doubles the strain on our military forces because they end up having to hold the bag. The National Security Council continues to struggle to coax coordinated policy execution out of a stovepiped government bureaucracy. The U.S. economy's capacity to indefinitely sustain spending on defense that exceeds the next 30 nations combined, on top of spending in Afghanistan and Iraq that may reach $1 trillion in Obama's first term, is also in serious doubt. And rather than facing these existential challenges and perils with a united and bipartisan coalition at home, Obama is coping instead with a fractured and deeply divided body politic in Washington. At times, it seems that political opponents seem more interested in scoring points and seeing him fail than seeing America succeed. Finally, in my tale of woes here, a recent Pew poll showed that isolationist sentiment is rising dramatically in the American populace, with 42% responding that the United States should, quote, mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along as best they can on their own, end quote. That mirrors a similar shift towards isolation and withdrawal that came after the Vietnam War. I can assure you, especially in this era of globalization, you may not care about foreign policy or the business of other nations, but if you're America, they care about you. So while I don't argue that the sun has set on the American era, a surprising number of foreign policy and national security experts I've talked to recently, in the recent years, now see the United States in a fading light, its influence and power declining relative to our recent past and to the challenges we face. The overriding question that has driven much of my reporting in the last few years is why? What happened? What did we do wrong? And what can we do about it? When they look back at this period, how will historians explain the death of the post-Cold War period of great expectations and the dawn of this new period of persistent conflict and relative decline? And that's the opportunity I want to take tonight to share you my thoughts on that subject, because I believe a failure to understand the mistakes of our recent past will extend that decline and increase the perils on the path that our nation is now on. Everyone in this room knows the short answer to the question of why or what happened. Wars change the course of history. They forge new international orders and chart the ascent and decline of great powers and even empires. There is every chance that the United States' self-proclaimed global war on terror would do the same. After all, it was a war led and waged by the only superpower on earth, and one designed from its inception to challenge and in some cases topple the orthodoxies of the old world order. It has involved the invasion and occupation of 2 Muslim countries and the threat of preventive war against 2 others. In such a strategic swing for the fences, there were always carried the promise of great reward if we succeeded, but the promise of great risk if we failed. History is also replete with examples of major powers falling victim to the venerable bane of empire, hubris and imperial overreach. A noted strategist, Edward Luttwak, I quoted in one of my stories to this effect, quote, America is rediscovering an irony of history, played out over and over, where the single strongest power overreaches and provokes resistance, and the louder and more arrogantly it acts, the more resistance it provokes until its power is neutralized. But I'd like to take this opportunity really to go back a little further than the 9/11 attacks, because I believe the seeds of our current predicament were sowed before we ever were attacked, and that nothing about our response to those attacks was preordained. The vast majority of Americans grew up in a nation that has always cast an oversized shadow on the world stage, but it's easy to forget that we've been fit for that superpower suit of armor very recently. Throughout the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, we were basically free riders on the British. Only at the end of World War II in 1945, with Europe in ruins and the United Kingdom exhausted by 2 world wars, did the United States assume the mantle of Western leadership. For the first time, U.S. leaders had to grapple with and develop a grand strategy that would order the world to America's advantage and hopefully avoid the cataclysms that made the 20th century the bloodiest in history. At important points, great powers have visionary leadership, however, and we were lucky to have in that period really visionary leadership provided by Franklin Roosevelt and President Truman and Eisenhower, and the wise men that they assembled around them. They were drawn from the worlds of defense, from finance, from banking, from statecraft. There were the likes of Dean Acheson, George Kennan, Paul Nitschke, and George Marshall. They responded to the post-World War II period of epic crises with the strategic equivalent of a grand slam. They oversaw the establishment of the United Nations in hopes of avoiding future wars, the World Bank to fund post-war reconstruction, the International Monetary Fund to promote free trade and capitalism, the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe and avoid the mistakes of the interwar years where we basically punished Germany and it came back as a belligerent country. The article George Kennan published in Foreign Affairs on the Soviet Union, together with Nitschke's NSC Directive 68 and the establishment of NATO under the Secretary of State Dean Acheson, laid the foundation for the strategy of containment and deterrence that ultimately won the Cold War and deterred World War III. At the end of the Cold War, we confronted another seminal moment. And the U.S. was once again blessed, I think, by visionary leaders who came of age in World War II and its aftermath. President Ronald Reagan pressed the Soviet Union towards collapse, and President George H.W. Bush engineered a soft landing. Under the steady hand of top officials such as James Baker, Brent Scrokoff, and Colin Powell, the U.S. promoted the peaceful reunification of Germany, expanded NATO in a protective embrace of new democracies in the former Warsaw Pact, and turned back the state-on-state aggression of Iraq over Kuwait. In the last great strategic consensus this country made in that period, I would argue, we rejected the call to bring the boys home, and that would have led to a reordering of the world and the blueprint of balance of power, with the United States one of many regional major powers. Instead, we kept a superpower military without a superpower rival, and we secured for a time the gains of democracy in the 1990s. At that other important point, however, there was a generational passing of the torch as the World War II generation began to recede from center stage in Washington. The election of Bill Clinton in 1992 and the Republican Revolution of 1994 represented a generational passing of the torch for the World War II generation to the new generation of baby boomers. Rather than the binding experience of World War II and the Depression, however, the baby boomers carried the divisions that were left over from the Vietnam War, the 1960s, the Cultural Revolution, and yes, Watergate and Nixon. And at a critical moment, I argue that a bipartisan consensus in the United States' role in the world, somehow held together during the Cold War by the political center in America, has splintered. As I wrote in War and Destiny, quote, "The atlas of the post-World War II global order was about to be shaken by the inconsistencies of a superpower at war with itself." I still think that atlas is shaking today. The post-Cold War decade of the 90s emerged an ongoing struggle between opposing political movements in this country with largely incompatible worldviews. Clashes in that battle can be seen in the Republican Revolution of 1994, the shutdown of the federal government in 1995, the 1998 Kosovo War that was called Clinton Wars by his Republican opponents, the 1999 impeachment of President Clinton, and the 1999 rejection by a Republican Senate of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the first such treaty rejection since the Versailles Treaty establishing the League of Nations in the 1920s. As a party in power, the Democrats struggled with what it meant to be an indispensable nation in this period of globalization. They faced wars of nationalism, tribalism, and self-determination that had been kept in check during the Cold War but erupted with increasing frequency, spurred by the erosion of national borders and international norms and the politicization of people around the world. We saw the proliferation of extremism, terrorism, criminal cartels, and doomsday weapons. For its part, the Republican Party, out of power, flirted with various foreign policy philosophies. First, there was isolationism that we saw of Howard Taft and the Republican Party that was embodied in the books and speeches of Pat Buchanan. There was the nationalist populism of Andrew Jackson, the champion of American exceptionalism and states' rights, embodied in officials like Jesse Helms, John Bolton, and Vice President Dick Cheney. There were the traditional realists and internationalists in the mode of Alexander Hamilton, men like Colin Powell and Brent Scowcroft and James Baker. And then there are the neoconservatives who took the inspiration from William Crystal and anti-communist Democrats associated with Scoop Jackson, people like Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, Richard Pearl. I argue that the result of those domestic divisions were that during a critical period of transition in this country, from the Cold War era, we sent confused signals to the rest of the world. One moment we were fighting a humanitarian war in Kosovo, expanding NATO, ratifying the Chemical Weapons Convention, and creating the World Trade Organization. The very next moment we were stiffing the United Nations on its dues, our dues, rejecting the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, imposing unilateral economic sanctions, threatening to abolish the International Monetary Fund, and refusing to even talk to our adversaries. The result, I argue, is that a decade of uncertain American leadership saw troubling deterioration of global stability, as threats such as proliferation, failed states, and ethnic cleansing and terrorism festered and metastasized. In that context, I saw the Bush election in 2000 as another important battle in that ongoing struggle between different worldviews. It was the Republicans' turn now, and the Bush administration stocked itself with senior Jacksonian nationalists such as Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and John Bolton, and neoconservatives such as Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, Scooter Libby, and others. Even before 9/11 attacks, the Bush revolutionaries determined to shift the tectonic plates of world affairs, offering a radical new answer to the question of how the American Colossus would wield its preponderant power. They wasted no time in rejecting arms control agreements, proposing new nuclear weapons for our arsenal, distancing the United States from its traditional role as peacekeeper in Northern Ireland and the Middle East. And they also embraced a value-based foreign policy that included bellicose rhetoric for those deemed evil. Defending those challenges, the Bush revolutionaries based their doctrines on American exceptionalism, or the idea that the nation's unique power and commensurate responsibilities should exempt us from traditional constraints. Now, after 25 years in Washington, I can assure you that the system is built on checks and balances that can be counted on usually to dilute this kind of radical reforms and ideologies. Divided government and vested interests dictate compromise and temper revolutionary zeal. But as we all saw, 9/11 changed that. It wasn't the source of all our troubles, but it was a catalyst, another critical moment requiring visionary leadership, and I would argue that we're still coping today with the profound consequences of the vision that was presented. And development of the Bush Doctrine represented a revolutionary strategy. It was wedded to a bold and ambitious premise. American power, unconstrained by traditional bonds of international law and treaties and binding alliances, honed to an insurmountable edge by military transformation, could not just deter and contain, but decisively defeat the great threats confronting us: nihilistic Islamic terrorism, the spread of doomsday weapons, proliferation of rogue and failed states that nourish both those scourges. From that strategic vision logically flowed parts of the Bush Doctrine that we're all familiar with: the elevation of preemptive war and the downgrading of the more defensive doctrine of deterrence and containment that won the Cold War. The focus on regime change in nations deemed evil and thus irreconcilable. There was unilateral action masked by ad hoc coalitions of the willing. And in his 2002 State of the Union address, I would argue that President Bush, his evocation of America that was anointed to confront a spreading evil around the world, preemptively and unilaterally if need be, played well to the heartland after 9/11, but it seemed messianic and threatening to much of the rest of the world. An American superpower attacked by a handful of terrorists was suddenly brandishing its sword at all the nuclear rogues in the world, without consultation with its allies or nods to international organizations. The backlash, I argue, damaged international institutions and strategic relationships that underpinned the world order, shaking it to its foundations. The UN was paralyzed by Iraq, as we all saw. NATO was sidelined, and European Union was split into old Europe and new Europe. So it's pretty clear where I'm going with this. I think we find ourselves in a period of dangerous decline, facing challenges that threaten to overwhelm us, because we weakened the foundations of the old world order and attempted to install a new paradigm for America's role in the world that has been almost universally rejected, not the least of which by the Bush administration itself in the second term, which shifted much more back to a traditional foreign policy approach when it saw the backlash of what it had created. I would argue that there was never, meanwhile, and this grossly underestimated in this period, that these challenges of globalization were going to be much more difficult than we anticipated. And those challenges have festered, those problems have festered. And now we confront them in a weakened state with our alliances in tatters. And based on the debate among candidates in last year's presidential election, I would also argue that this debate has not been finished. I was struck by the fact that on issues like closing Guantanamo, engaging in dialogue with adversaries, that a lot of the candidates thought that we should go back to the first Bush term. I believe the debate about America's rightful role in the world is still unsettled, and we're likely to see it become very lively as the Obama administration puts the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty back before the Senate this year, or next year, I should say, when he tries to engage in the Middle East again as more of a middle interlocutor and put pressure on Israel to stop settlements. And he listens to and makes his decision on Afghanistan while his own base is telling him to bring the boys home. I would like to end this by talking, and then we can open it up for conversation. You might want to get closer up to current events, which I've been very involved in writing about. But I think we should think about what we learned about the failure of the Bush Revolution that should inform the debate we have going forward. Because Iraq was a seminal milestone precisely because it was expression of a worldview and a foreign policy philosophy that has not gone away. As I mentioned, many Republican candidates in last year's election seemed to adhere more stubbornly to its precepts than the Bush administration itself in its second term. This battle we hear more and more about between the soul of the Republican Party, between purists and coalition builders, will have a lot to say about the endurance of the worldview that informed the first Bush term. The first lesson to me of the Bush Revolution was the fallacy in its view on alliances. The assumption that if America, the superpower, led assertively, that its allies would be forced to follow was patently mistaken, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. That failure denied us from the very beginning a northern front through Turkey for the Iraq War, and probably cost us Turkey as a strategic ally. In fact, the insistence that the mission, quote unquote, would define the coalition in Afghanistan and Iraq was followed by Bush administration admissions that the coalitions as assembled have proven woefully inadequate to the task at hand. The belief that the United States could claim exception and unshackle itself from the constraints of arms control treaties and international laws and norms, yet still rally the world against rogue state proliferators and terrorists, to me was also badly misguided. The mistaken belief that the problems of a globalized, interlinked world could be solved unilaterally by a nation state relying on military force primarily, rather than cooperatively and multilaterally according to international norms, was disastrous for U.S. standing. I want to quote Brent Scowcroft again, if I could. He told me, quote, globalization in this age is what the Industrial Revolution was nearly 200 years ago, because it changes everything. The erosion of national borders and the politicization of people around the world have created problems like terrorism, proliferation, that can only be dealt with through cooperation. The decision by the Bush administration to go in the opposite direction and try to deal with these problems as a unilateral nation state using traditional military power is what has brought America to the point of crisis. Another fallacy, I think, was the Bush administration's view on the efficacy of military power. There was an over-reliance on conventional military power, shock and awe. I saw it firsthand, and a failure to understand the limits of such power when applied to non-state terrorists or insurgents in situations where overwhelming force turned local populations against us and into the arms of our adversaries. I also think there was a fallacy that the United States could spread democracy as a reliable antidote to terrorism. That was based on an understandable but misguided hope that the elections were a solution to the root causes of terrorism, even in places with no democratic institutions or traditions, and where our actions are perceived as installing democracy at the point of a gun. As we've seen in recent elections in Afghanistan, in Iran, in the Palestinian territories, in Lebanon, elections without the fundamental institutions of democracy are often more destabilizing than not. Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, was number 3 in the Bush in the Bush State Department in his first term. He told me, quote, "There are a number of reasons why democracy makes for a poor lodestar for U.S. foreign policy, beginning with the fact that many prerequisites for democracy don't exist in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. Even if we could transplant democracy, it's not a panacea for our problems. Democracies take many decades to take root, and immature democracies are often dangerous and highly prone to hijacking by nationalist or populist forces." I also think another misguided notion of the Bush doctrine was this elevation of preemptive war to such a top priority or a top focus. Not against terrorists, but against other nation states as a way to combat the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I'm not arguing that any option should be taken off the table when we confront nations like North Korea or Iran, but the performance of our intelligence community in the Iraq case should give all of us pause that we have the clarity of view on people's weapons of mass destruction that would justify preemptive war. Rather than coerce Iran and North Korea to abandon their nuclear weapons, preemptive war in Iraq encouraged them to speed up those programs in hopes of deterring U.S. regime change. Because preventive war doctrine requires nations to accurately predict the future, Otto von Bismarck called it, quote, "committing suicide because you're afraid of dying." Another fallacy in the New World Order envisioned by the Bush revolutionaries was this yawning mismatch between the strategic vision and the lofty rhetoric and the consistently underwhelming means to fulfill that vision. They launched a grand campaign to eradicate terror from the globe and end tyranny in our world, yet failed to rally a sustainable coalition in Iraq and Afghanistan, skimped on ground forces, resisted increasing the size of the military, and refused putting the nation on a wartime footing by asking for sacrifices. If anything, 8 years of nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq should have taught us by now, it should be that we should have a little humility about our ability to change the nature of other societies. Former neocon, I would say redressed neocon, and author of The End of History, Francis Fukuyama said, "For an administration that set unbelievably ambitious goals, the implementation was like watching a patient with attention deficit disorder." Secretary Rumsfeld said you go to war with the army you have, not with the army you wish you had. Well, you also craft foreign policy for the government you have, not the government you wish you had. If you can't count on competent follow-through in terms of your intelligence agencies, nation-building apparatus, and military establishment, then you should be less ambitious. You should set less ambitious goals. You should quit biting off more than you can chew. And the final fallacy I would point to, what I see as the first Bush term, was the failure to fully appreciate that it wasn't really the globe-spanning U.S. military that was the foundation of our superpower status. It was U.S. economic competitiveness. Failure to realize that, I think, led to runaway deficits in a time of when the economy was doing well, and to a failure to really protect our economy with the same zeal that they protect the homeland. Indeed, at core, I think the Bush Revolution was fundamentally premised on a misjudgment about the nature of American power. They convinced themselves and a lot of their countrymen that good intentions and U.S. military might make right in world affairs. They failed to see how the perception of a superpower run amok would diminish the greater source of American power, the principles and ideals that others freely embrace and by which our good intentions and leadership are judged. So what happened? I would end by saying I think what happened was at a critical moment for the West, with storm clouds gathering all around, our leadership beacon flickered. I actually believe President Obama is trying to reignite that flame. His Nobel Prize is an indication of the relief of much of the rest of the world that we seem to be tacking towards a more traditional American approach to the world. But to fully recapture the flame, it will require piecing back together a domestic consensus about America's rightful role in the world. And I'm not sure that can be rebuilt. I've been struck in Obama's initiative to reset relations with Russia, engage with Iran, press for a Mideast peace, and rein in nuclear proliferation, that he's been backed by a number of Republican stalwarts such as Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell, George Shultz, and Henry Kissinger. But where is the support from centrists in Congress and from this generation of leaders and politicians? It was the center of the U.S. political spectrum that was the foundation for America's leadership of the West, a center that produced presidents like Gerald Ford. The center is not held in American politics. As we tend to our domestic deliberations going forward, I would argue that nations at war with themselves are not looked upon for world leadership, and they rarely aspire to greatness. Thank you very much. Now we can do the fun part. Any questions, comments?
You have microphones on each side?
I see one back there.
Did you read President Bush Sr. Book about the Desert Storm? Have you read that book?
The one he wrote with Brent Scowcroft?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
The point I was interested in your comment. In the book, he stated he wanted to go after Saddam, but he didn't for two reasons. One was he did not want to go in alone, and the UN would not support him. And two, he was told if he went in, it would be a disaster. It would not be overnight. And I was wondering how you translate that into what his son did.
Is there a psychiatrist in the house? I mean, it's a couple interesting points about that. I mean, what President George H.W. Bush did with Iraq was masterful. He built a coalition that was not only a mile wide, it was a mile deep. We didn't even pay for that war. We did not even pay for the war. It had many Arab nations on it, so it would total legitimacy in the area amongst the neighbors of Iraq. It was blessed by the United Nations, including getting the Russia's vote, which we may never see again, but it was an amazing piece of diplomacy. And he put it before Congress, something that even Scowcroft was worried that he should do, but it passed barely, but that's how you build consensus in this country. It was really a masterful job. Now, some of the people who, like Paul Wolfowitz, who was number 3 in the Pentagon, always thought we should have chased the Iraqi army back to Baghdad and toppled Saddam. And a number of those people, Richard Pearl, Wolfowitz, ended up with senior positions in Bush 43's administration. You know, I did a cover story from our magazine on October 2001. And the cut line was, is Iraq next? Is that the next front on the global war on terror? Because I knew the predilections of these guys, and that I knew, and then I confirmed by calling some of them, that when the Bush team met on September the 15th, a couple days after 9/11, at Camp David to talk about what the reaction was going to be, very quickly the discussion turned to Iraq. Rumsfeld was offering, we have to go after Iraq. So there was an inclination to go after Iraq to finish up the business that had not been completed. I think, and it, to me, gets to the revolutionary, people who think in big ideas and revolutionary ideas are not the most cautious people in the world. The first President Bush was a cautious man. He knew that if he had gone towards Baghdad, he would have lost all of the Arab members of that coalition. He'd have lost the United Nations. And it would have been a Pyrrhic victory because we would have been stuck in Iraq, as we are to this day stuck in Iraq. And I would argue that model of leadership would put us in better stead in the world. I mean, we really rode a great wave from that, where for quite a while the idea of nation-state to nation-state aggression, after we turned it back so decisively in Kuwait, was kind of off the table. And I know Brent Scowcroft wanted a New World Order where that would never happen again. I'm not sure we're there, but it was a good start, and they didn't overdrive the culminating point of the operation, which was kicking Iraq out of Kuwait. And I think many people think that after really masterfully handling Afghanistan, the Bush 43 team overdrove the culminating point of operations by turning their attention to Iraq.
I have a question, I guess. You're obviously focusing on foreign affairs, and to me, the concern I have is the economy, I guess, and the glorious period you talked about from 1945 on, I think America was flush with cash. Now we're not. I mean, and I don't know that we will be in another 20 years. And so how can we fortify any international standing when we don't have the money, and we won't have the money?
I think you're exactly right, and I talk to people in the military all the time, and this is something that they worry about quite a lot. We can't afford a globe-spanning military at this level with the economic problems we have, but we really can't afford to decrease it right now because we're in these wars. So the first answer is we've got to find ways to wind up operations in Iraq first and then in Afghanistan. We have to be very careful about getting entangled in other wars. would be a suggestion. Take the 1991 Gulf War. If you do, I think what Obama's trying to do is rebuild these coalitions so we act together, so you're not bearing so much of the burden. We shouldn't be bearing as much of the burden we are in Afghanistan, but already in Europe, after 8 years, it's Bush's war and it's unpopular, and their politicians aren't going to jump both feet in to help us. They're there, but they're not there as big as they should be. So, it talks to the importance of collective action, coalitions. The wider, the deeper, the better, because we, as Brent Scowcroft said, our skill is in building coalitions and building in motivating collective action and spreading that burden around. The idea that we could do it alone, because quite honestly, they thought that it would be a lot easier in Afghanistan. Afghanistan kind of confused them. Oh, that was easy. Let's try that in Iraq. And it didn't work out. Don Rumsfeld thought we would be out of Iraq late in the fall of 2003, the year we invaded. So that was a really bad judgment. They thought Iraqi oil would pay for the operation. That was a really bad judgment. So I would argue that the best thing we can do is start thinking collectively about multilateralism, burden sharing. We're the only country that can lead the West, but if we can't lead the West, we should really ask, do we need to be doing this? Because doing this alone has gotten too hard, it's too expensive. And oh, by the way, it doesn't make you any friends, It really doesn't. Yes, sir?
So I submit that the Nobel Peace Prize has already lost its potent text, if you will. And if the President of the United States, if our president gets the Nobel War Prize in December, I think it's given in December usually, after he sends more troops to Afghanistan, it will become the laughing stock of the world and nobody will be able to pay attention to the Nobel War Prize from now on. I believe he will not send the troops till after he gets the Nobel Peace Prize, if you will. What do you think of it?
I'll wager a little something on the side when we get out of here. I think he's going to say yes to tens of thousands of more troops.
Before he gets the Nobel Peace Prize in December.
Oh, the timing, before December. You might have me there. I think it's going to be right. I don't think that's really his driving motivation on when he's going to make that decision.
No, I think others may advise him on that.
Yeah, I would suspect it's going to come before then, to be honest with you. There's a lot of angst right now, this period of indecision. He's being very deliberative. I had a chance to talk to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs recently, who thinks that this long deliberative process has actually unearthed things they hadn't thought enough about in detail, and he supports it. But at some point you need a decision, because the indecision itself creates a sort of dynamic that's not helpful in the region. I think that everyone has their own view about what kind of weight to give the Nobel Peace Prize decision. I think it was way beyond the war in Afghanistan. People were really supporting what they saw was a return to the kinds of American leadership that they were used to. And I think that the America of the last 6 years of 2001 to 2007 scared the hell out of them. And I think that they know that there's no other country that can take our place. So a world that our leadership's not trusted becomes a very scary world for a lot of countries. And so there's a huge hunger out there for sort of a return to traditional American centrist internationalist leadership. And I think that's what that was a signal of. I think it could marginally be helpful on some world stages. I'm thinking of being a peacemaker. You always bring a certain, if you can sit down at a peace table with Israelis and Palestinians and say, hey, I just won the Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe you get a little juice out of that. I don't know. I don't see how it hurts myself, but I know some people think it does.
Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry.
I was wondering, with the cost of energy and where it's located, what your thoughts would be on if we were to develop a comprehensive energy policy which would reduce our need for foreign energy resources. How would that affect all these actors on the world stage?
Scare the hell out of the Saudi Arabians. I think that would be a very, very healthy thing. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I don't think we're going to be energy independent. I don't think that's in the cards. But if we were much less energy dependent, I think it would give us much more freedom of action in the Middle East in a way that would be very helpful. We have to worry about the Middle East in a way that, and it's a very dysfunctional area. And I'm all for trying to help it along through diplomacy and good works. But being mired in the Middle East is not a very pleasant place to be mired. Like I said, it's very dysfunctional, a huge amount of regional rivalries. Your very presence as an infidel and an American or a Westerner is not. I guarantee you, the last unit out of Iraq will not be having any people lining up and giving parade routes. It's just the nature of the beast. So I think that would be very helpful. I think an energy policy is long overdue in this country. Obama's agenda is pretty full right now, though. I don't know when he's going to get around to that. Yes, sir.
Aren't you being a bit pessimistic about the ability of Obama to get things back on track, multilateralism, more diplomacy, etc.? Aren't there really some good signs? For example, many of our former allies seem to be embracing Obama. They like Obama. World opinion is shifting more in our favor, and so on.
Absolutely, I take your point, and I agree with everything you just said. However, I would have hoped to see a little more support from him here at home. And what I worry about is the debate that I know it was a long litany about, past history, but the debate's not settled on any of these things. If you looked at our last election and looked at what the chief candidates that were, one one's going to be the President of the United States. A lot of them were embracing what just got us in so much trouble. So, Obama has been dealt, as I said, this really difficult inbox. If he stumbles, he gets thrown out in 4 years. I suspect there'll be another rather radical shift back to all the things I just described. So, yeah, I take your point. I think that he's doing it, and I think this is why centrists like Scowcroft and Powell and Kissinger and others have really sort of tried to give him bolstering support. But I'm rather confounded by our own domestic political dynamic now. We don't seem to understand what it means, what our role in the world is anymore. And so it seems we keep vacillating between these two political arguments and worldviews, and they're not very compatible. And until we find some center area we can all sort of agree on, I worry that Obama will just be one more shift this way before it shifts radically that way. That's not how the world wants us to help lead it. But I take your point. I think there are a lot of very positive things he's done. And if he can show enough success that becomes sort of a conventional wisdom that the things I'm talking about is the way to approach world problems, the things that Brent Scowcroft talked about, then I think that I will be much more hopeful. Right now, what I see is people, political opponents who are really, in his first year, saying, boy, we want to clip this guy at the knees, stop the Obama juggernaut. Well, oh, by the way, he's your president for the next 3 years, so if he clipped him at the knees his first year, the world's going to be a pretty hard place to deal with. So that's my concern, but I take your point. He's done a lot of very positive things, and he's gotten, like I said, the Nobel was just sort of a bauble. There is a huge sigh of relief globally. I spent a lot of time traveling overseas and talking to these people, and a huge sigh of relief that he's a more traditional American leader that they've come to expect from us. Yes, sir?
You mentioned the fact that the major events in the terrorist war have come from Al-Qaeda. Is Al-Qaeda, can we still pinpoint the terrorist threat as Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and are they worth going after?
Yes and yes, we can still pinpoint. That doesn't mean that if you got, Osama bin Laden has probably created a movement that will survive him. But what is really interesting about all these plots, this guy, the Denver baggage handler, a recently thwarted plot in Spain that was going to repeat the Madrid bombings in Barcelona, the aircraft plot in the UK that was going to take down 15 airliners in 2005. all of them still have a link to a facilitator and training bases and planning amongst Al-Qaeda Corps in Pakistan. So they're still plotting, they're still trying, they're not being as successful about it. And one reason why not is because we know kind of where they are, and we've got every intelligence asset in the Western world focused right there, and it's helpful, which is why if you were to lose Afghanistan and they suddenly had a whole country again to roam free on, it creates some issues. We know, our intelligence services know who goes in and out of that region and who flies back to, London via Stockholm. They know, they have all their wiretapping. So, yes, they're still a threat. Yes, they're still out there. Yes, we are still going after them, and it would be very useful to get them to symbolically. Now, I don't think that would be the end of the problem with terrorism, but it would certainly be helpful.
Excuse me. APAC? Could you tell me about APAC and how that influences our Middle East policies and how strong they are at directing our policies towards the Middle East?
As far as setting oil prices, or?
I'm talking about the American Israel.
Oh, APAC, the lobby. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Had a senior moment there. The lobby, the Israeli lobby in Washington is very strong. APAC is the most powerful of that lobby. There are others, the Israel Project and others. One of the problems we have, and I've written a lot and been to Israel twice in the last year in the West Bank and written this story. If you're going to be an interlocutor and a mediator in that conflict, you have to put pressure on both sides. And no president, as George H.W. Bush found out, gets any political gain at home by putting pressure on Israel. You'll remember that his Secretary of State, James Baker, was going to withhold some money that we give Israel. It's the number one recipient of our aid in the world. And it just got inundated with complaints from Jewish groups in Washington. So it's a difficult balancing act for any American president to try to put pressure on Israel. But if you don't do it, you're not doing Israel any favor. As one of my Israeli peace movement friends said, it's the friends don't let friends drive drunk philosophy. If you write Israel a blank check, there are political dynamics within Israel that makes it very hard for their administrations to stand up to the settler movement. And as long as the settler movement is taking swaths of land in the West Bank, you're whittling away at the two-state solution. So AIPAC's powerful, the lobby's powerful. There are other Israel. They're starting to see other lobbying groups who are more. Yes, it's a good thing to put pressure on both sides because we want to see peace. We don't want to see perpetual conflict for Israel. So, and I think Obama gets credit for saying very, very strong words. We think the settlements are illegitimate. It's been the policy of America since 1967, but it doesn't get said very much because you don't usually, you get some grief when you say it. But it's deadlocked right now, I'll say that. It's deadlocked. The coalition in Israel doesn't think that it can survive really cracking down on the settler movement. It has strong settler movement representation in the coalition. And the divide within the Palestinians between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority is such that gives the Israelis an excuse to say, even if we wanted to reach a deal, we don't have a unified Palestinian voice. So it's deadlocked. But did I answer your question?
How powerful are they here to direct our policy? How can we actually be able, as the rest of the country, say how we want our country to look?
They're powerful. They're certainly not all powerful. I mean, there's what you find in this is there's not a countervailing lobby for the Palestinians, and there's not a countervailing lobby for Arab countries. So that magnifies their power in a way because there's no opponent. In the lobbying wars in Washington, there's almost two sides, almost everything. And that's kind of a one-sided deal. So they're powerful, domestically. I mean, but I would caution, don't think they're all powerful. There's plenty of things presidents have done that have not been from the, a page from the blueprint from AIPAC. But Yeah, they have an influence. Yes, sir.
Can we call ourselves a democracy now where essentially most legislative power is vested in lobbies?
The lobby and, well, you know,
As an individual voter,
I actually think we're still a democracy. I don't want to leave you with that kind of a grim assessment. But I mean, the money in politics is discouraging because, and I'll tell you what I think is the most discouraging. And all the things that I described about the lack of a political center, I think the most important reform we should look at would be to get out of this gerrymandering of voting districts, because it has really gotten to such a, they can do it so well now that we've created safe blue and red districts around the country that people have no reason to want to compromise because they'll always be safe back home. And the electorate is not there. The electorate is much more centrist, but we've gerrymandered it to fare thee well to the point where the center just does not hold in Washington anymore. It's really the wings of both parties are ascendant, and it's not only led to a poisonous political atmosphere, which, you know, President Ford talked about at one of the Ford Awards that I was at. But it's driving good people out, and it's creating this us against them that really, you know, you're so blinded by trying to, you know, make the other guy fail, you forget that you're all Americans and we got some problems we got to push behind the same wheelbarrow on. So that to me is the most discouraging thing. But the money in politics is also discouraging, and you know, they've had campaign finance reform, and I think the Supreme Court's about to throw it out the window. So it's not an easy system to get your hands around. Yes, sir.
The 1980s seem to have been a pivotal time in the formation of U.S. Middle East policy. I wonder if you would comment about the effect of the Iran-Contra affair, the U.S. role in the Iran-Iraq war, and the virtual invitation of Iraq to Kuwait on the subsequent events.
You know, our policy in the 80s... Sorry?
Repeat the question.
He's asking about the 1980s and how they were sort of a seminal period for our Middle East peace process, our Middle East policy, and the Iran, you know, our policy in the Iran-Iraq war. What was the other one?
Iran-Contra.
The Iran-Contra.
And inviting Iraq to go into Kuwait.
Inviting Iraq to go into Kuwait. That was actually a stupid move by an ambassador who got out in front of her skis, as Colin Powell would say. I don't think that we were really, it was a policy to invite him to invade Kuwait. Read the surprise when he actually did it. The Iran-Iraq war, you know, as was described to me at the time by, you know, U.S. military leaders, damn, we're sorry that they both can't lose this. We chose what we thought was the best of a bad pair there and supported Iraq. You know, ever since the Carter Doctrine, we basically said we have got a fundamental national interest in the Middle East. And the Middle East is very hard for people who want to have a fundamental interest in it because it's a messy place. And you layer on top of that the whole Cold War, where it was another proxy theater between us and the Soviets. And we did a lot of stupid things. You know, Iran-Contra, I can't even imagine, you know, afterwards what Reagan must have thought about how he got involved in that. You know, he was the person who was never going to discuss, you know, kidnapping and terrorists, and there he was negotiating this very convoluted deal that got him in so much trouble. So, you know, I kind of put the 80s, I kind of put a lot of it to the Cold War, using the Middle East as a proxy, but we, you know, because of energy, we've got huge strategic interests there. And until we, you know, develop an energy policy that makes that our dependence less and gives us more leverage and more freedom of maneuver, I think we're going to be stuck with this Machiavellian, you know, who's up, who's down, who do you support, who's the bad guy, who's the good guy. It's messy. Way in the back there in the yellow sweater.
Thank you. My question is about Pakistan, which seems to me has had the potential for being the worst nightmare out there.
Correct.
And I would love to hear, I'd love to hear you disabuse me of that fact, but I don't think you can or will. But I would love to hear your speculation about the path in the next 5 years if you were counseling the folks who were trying to steer our way through this minefield.
Well, thanks a lot for that. No, I can't dissuade you from the fact that it is a nightmare on many levels. It's probably the worst nightmare. And I actually think that's why I feel that Obama's probably going to agree to tens of thousands more troops for Afghanistan, because if you signal, Afghanistan's going bad, and it's going to keep going bad until we turn it around or the other side wins. And the other side wins it's easy to sketch a number of scenarios, but the first one you think about is, the Pakistanis originally created the Taliban to wield influence in this chaotic civil war in Afghanistan. It's their hedge for influence on a border state. And as soon as they think that we're heading for the exits, they're going to start making those hedge bets again with the Taliban. That's number one. The Pakistanis have one good reason to be rather upset with us. We funded these mujahideen groups to fight the Soviets, and after the Soviet Union, was defeated and then collapsed, we basically pulled out of there and left them with the mess of these guys. Then we went in 2001 and toppled the Taliban, drove Al-Qaeda and the Taliban into the Pakistan frontier regions, and then basically turned it around and left and looked towards Iraq. And these groups have formed linkages, and it's not just that the Afghan Taliban now want to regain control in Afghanistan, it's that the Pakistan Taliban now wants to turn Pakistan into an Islamic caliphate. And Al-Qaeda's in there stirring that whole pot on both sides. So I actually think that, to be a little bit hopeful, what has happened recently with Pakistan going into first the Swat Valley and clearing out Al-Qaeda, because that really got out of control, and then going into South Waziristan, something we've been asking them to do for years, is a hopeful sign. We've got a democratically elected government, weak, and we have a military that's finally taken the threat that we say to them is their most serious threat. It's not India, it's these guys internally who are trying to destabilize your government. And they seem to be taking it seriously. So, you could short-term be a little bit optimistic that they may have turned a pivot point in understanding this threat is against them. But I think if you're making that pivot point, your last thing you want to do is send any signals that you're heading for the exits, which is why I think we're gonna go a little deeper into Afghanistan, just because the alternative, for the reasons we're discussing, are pretty grim. I mean, there in Pakistan you do have a country with nuclear weapons, a weak central government, and an active insurgency that, Admiral Mullen said was basically the epicenter of Islamic extremism in the world. That's a very scary combination. So,
5-year prospects?
If we tough it out in Afghanistan and we keep the pressure on Pakistan, but also carrots and sticks, which we've been doing. Kerry Biden bill $1.5 billion for economic aid every year for the next 5 years. Secretary Clinton, I give him hats off. She went over there and really just opened herself up to a huge amount of criticism, which any American gets in Pakistan these days. Took the brunt of that because it let them vent, but said, we have to be partners in this at the end of that. And that message came through. I mean, I could be very cautiously optimistic on the 5-year outlook. I would be, if the decision is, Afghanistan's too tough, we got to start pulling out within a year, I would have a very much more negative outlook for Pakistan. Yes, sir?
With our all-volunteer armed forces being stretched to the limit, you anticipate we'll have a draft coming up?
No. I don't think the country is ready for it. I don't think the military wants it. We have this great military. I'm sure everyone's noticed that. It's really an amazing military. But it's amazing military because they're all professionals. They stay in their jobs and they learn those jobs and they grow their own leadership. So they're now every one of them is combat experience. So we've got a very good military. And the military, the idea of going through the energy of drafting a guy that you can have for a year or two max, and then spending all the time training him up and slotting him in, and then he's gone. And, oh, by the way, he may not want to be there. It doesn't appeal to them. So I don't see, for those two reasons, that we're going to have a draft. If anything, I would suggest that we should grow the all-volunteer force. We should probably grow it more than it's grown. If the military is right, and this is a period of persistent conflict, and we're going to be rotating them in and out of combat zones around the world, we need a bigger military. So I think that's the way we would go. And that means that's expensive. So that gets back to the point of how do we afford this? So, you know, there are no easy answers here, but I'm pretty sure the draft, you just never hear it, and the person who says it gets shouted down pretty quick, so I don't think it's in the cards. Yes, sir?
Are you familiar with Barnett's work? The one who's a futurist with teaches at the War College, and
I'm not familiar with his work. I've heard his name.
well, one of the things that he suggests in terms of military is that we need two sets of armed forces. One is that superpower, what he calls the Leviathan army, and that we are the superpower of the world, period. We are it. But that's all we've had, and so we'll go in, and when it's nation to nation, there's no problem. But now with this guerrilla warfare and other things, it's a real problem. So he's saying that theoretically what we need is a second army that's more nation building, which, as I understand, is what Petraeus started in Iraq, was to get troops in and not just fighting anymore, but helping to build logistically from village to village their infrastructures so that they can rebuild their own country in their own way.
Right.
Theoretically, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Right.
That that's what we would need.
Right.
My question would be, given the distress that Middle East has with the U.S., even if all those positive intentions and we went that direction, could that work? Do we need to really have more of a coalition with other forces in the Middle East who might help with that process, that they would have more credibility? So I'd like to know what you think about that.
Well, you ask and actually answer your own question pretty well. But you know, and my friend Andrew Krepinovich from the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments has also suggested this, and he's a counterinsurgency expert, that we need really sort of peacekeeping brigades, and we need high-level combat brigades, because right now we're so shifted towards the peacekeeping counterinsurgency, which is like you're fighting and peacekeeping, armed peacekeeping, that you're degrading the skills to do the high-end stuff. The Army's resisted this because it's struggling right now at the numbers it's been granted by Congress to find people to deploy to these wars. They're deploying with only a year in between deployments. If you had a peacekeeping unit and a high-intensity conflict unit, that would exacerbate your rotation problem, because there's a number of units you can't send into the peacekeeping and vice versa. So I don't think it's going to happen, to be honest with you. I think that, you know, the Army is starting to talk about advise and assist brigades, which is basically peeling brigades down to just do this function of standing up indigenous security forces. That seems to be more likely. A temporary sort of reconfiguring of a brigade that'll be heavy on whatever, you know, training, mentoring kind of things, heavy on calling in, you know, U.S. air support and things like that. You know, not as heavy, maybe heavy on logistics, but not as heavy on the point of the spear type stuff. That's the more likely way they're going to go, because in the end, they want as much flexibility as possible. And on the high intensity, you know, deter nation-state on nation-state war, we already have that division of labor. It's called the Air Force and the Navy are going to do that. And the Marine Corps and the Army are going to be doing the counterinsurgency stuff. But you also raise an interesting point. You know, the synergy we need to figure out with NATO is a lot of these NATO forces come from countries who don't want to put them in combat areas. But they can there's no reason they couldn't do these training missions better. And I think that some sort of division of labor within NATO is probably where we're headed to, because it's not the healthiest thing for an alliance that one person's doing the fighting and the bleeding and the other one's, but it's the de facto, the way it's working in Afghanistan. And I think to make a benefit of necessity there, we're probably going to head to that kind of division of labor. Just won't be as formal as your Barnett guy says. I don't think. The Army is going to be very resistant. Yes, ma'am.
One of the reasons for interest in the Middle Eastern countries is that they're a source of fuel and oil. And fuel and oil aren't going to last forever. How is that going to change things in the Middle East? And do you think the U.S. or other countries will find alternative
It gets back to the point of the question I had about an energy policy. I think that, I'm not one who looks at, you look at the numbers, and I'm not one who believes we can totally become energy self-sufficient. I think it was, we're too much of a consumer of energy, but you could certainly become much less dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Through wind, through nuclear, possibly, through solar, through water, through, wave power, through biofuels, et cetera. I think it's long past due we look at those things, and maybe drilling. I mean, our dependence on heavy dependence on Middle Eastern oil is a strategic ball and chain. It really is, and the less dependent on it we are, the better off we will be. I don't think we'll ever get totally independent of that, but if it's just a part, something, you've got much more leverage in freedom of maneuver than we do now.
Well, the oil that's in the ground can't last forever.
No.
That's why someday we're going to have to go to renewable.
I don't disagree. I think the only question is when that day is.
One last question.
One last question.
I remember when communism fell that people were calling for a national debate about our future role in the world. And now here we are 20 years later. How does that happen? I don't understand how we could have, in a country as large and diverse and divided as you've pointed out we are, how can we have a national debate without events just seeming to take over before the debate is over?
Well, and this gets to my pessimism about our own political dynamic. But I mean, I think we had a bit of the debate in the last presidential election where you had Obama saying, I'm going to talk to, Iran and Burma, or I don't think he said Burma, but I mean, he's really engaged with anyone who's willing to talk. And talked about building, rebuilding sort of traditional alliances, et cetera. And you had the other side saying, now you're appeasing Iran. It's ridiculous to talk to these people. Russia is just evil, so we should, rush Georgia and Ukraine into the NATO alliance. We started to have that debate. I think we need to have much more of it. I'm a little frustrated by the media dynamic where it's very hard to pin these guys down exactly where they are before they get into office, because they start the primaries and they tack to their base, and then they kind of swing back towards the middle. And they are becoming extremely, extremely good through focus groups and pollsters at figuring out exactly how to say the thing, so you can't pin them down. But I think we can't avoid this discussion about, does America, what do we want to, if we want to lead the world, we have to act in one way. The world doesn't want to be led the way we were acting in 2001, 2006. If we think that we don't want to be part of the world, you can try to pull up the drawbridge. If you think that you're powerful enough to act without friends, then you make that argument. So I think we're starting to have that debate. I'm a little bit, I think, my talk revealed that. I'm a little frustrated that we're not having it more front and center, because I still hear, the same arguments that, don't talk to your friends and coerce people into giving up their nuclear weapons, and unilateralism is okay because it's feeding your interest and you can't feed someone else's interest. I think we just tried that. It didn't work out so well. So I'm with you. We need more of this debate. We need to come to a consensus, the kind of middle consensus that both parties can find common ground on about the tenor of American leadership in this world. We're not there yet. I maintain it's because the center is not holding our politics anymore. And the far left and the far right will never agree, and so we're going to be constantly jerked back between the two, and that makes our leadership very, very unsettling for the rest of the world. So until we get the center built back up in a consensus like we had during the Cold War about deterrence and containment of the Soviet Union, till we get there, I don't see us aspiring to that greatness I talked about in this talk. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for such great questions, and I'll I'll give you a commercial for upcoming programs in a moment. We have a gift for our speaker, which is a pair of pens with President Ford's signature on them
Oh,
for
great.
your writing
Thank
enjoyment.
you. Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much.
Before we close, I want to invite you to an issues forum on the subject of the economy. That will be next Tuesday, Tuesday, November 17th here in the library. That's a different kind of a discussion. It's a facilitated or moderated discussion to fulfill President Ford's vision of civic discourse. There will not be an expert lecturing at you. It's a chance for you to think about some issues. And we had a great success, a huge turnout for our discussions on healthcare a couple of weeks ago. So this one's focused on the economy. Looking ahead to 2010, I want to alert you that we are planning a program on presidential museums. We're going to invite, or have invited, the head of presidential libraries from Washington, from the National Archives. That is in conjunction with the University of Michigan Lit School Museum Theme Semester, and that'll be a chance to learn about the philosophy behind presidential libraries and museums from a national perspective, and we think that'll be interesting. Also, the program that we had scheduled with Benton Becker on the Nixon pardon, we hope to reschedule. There was a health issue that had called for the postponement, but we're hoping that as soon as he can, he's eager to come, he was ready to come, and so we're hoping for that in 2010. Looking at the museum and on the subject of the Cold War, we are opening an exhibit that we are curating on the Cold War, spanning multiple administrations. We're opening that on January 21st, a Thursday evening, with Peter Ernest, a former CIA spy who heads the Spy Museum in Washington, and his counterpart, Oleg Kalugin, the former KGB general. So that's going to make, they are actually now a dynamic duo speaking post-Cold War. So that'll be a great program. So come on over to Grand Rapids. And we also have an invitation out to Brent Scowcraft to come in April and other speakers in between. So we have lots going on. We have a program meeting this Thursday of our internal staff. And so we're working hard to flesh things out for 2010. But in the lobby, you'll have a chance to meet our speaker. We have a reception for you, and you can look at our lobby, our small exhibit on the economy, what was happening when President Ford was president, as, gee, if we had done some of what he recommended on energy then, we wouldn't be where we are now. Thanks for coming.